The disappearance of Mekayla Bali. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in April 2016, a grandmother sat in her car outside a high school in a small Canadian prairie town, waiting for her granddaughter to walk out the front doors like she did every single day. The minutes ticked by, then an hour. The girl never came. That girl was 16-year-old Mekayla Bali, and what happened to her between that morning and that afternoon has never been solved. No body has ever been found, no suspect has ever been charged, and after more than a decade, her family is still lighting candles every April, still waiting by the phone, still hoping that somewhere out there, Mekayla is alive. This is the story of a small-town Canadian teenager who spent one strange, restless morning wandering in circles through her own town, making phone calls to no one anyone has ever identified, before walking out of a bus depot restaurant sometime around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and simply ceasing to exist. Welcome back to Vanishing Point. This one will stay with you. Who was Mekayla Bali? Michaela was born on July 2, 1999, in Regina, Saskatchewan, under a different name, Michaela Margaret Kim Niebergall. Only 7 months before she vanished, in September of 2015, her mother had her name legally changed to Bali. By the time she disappeared, she was going by that new surname everywhere, even though the paperwork had barely dried. She grew up in Yorkton, a quiet prairie city of around 16,000 people, roughly 2.5 hours northeast of Regina. Home was a household full of women: her mother Paula, her aunt, her maternal grandmother, and her 2 younger siblings, a brother and a sister who were only 9 and 7 years old at the time. Michaela's biological father was never officially confirmed. A man named Rick Brait was later floated publicly as a possible biological father, though this was never firmly established in any of the reporting. To make things heavier still, Michaela's grandfather, a man who lived in that same house, had died just 1 month before she disappeared, in March of 2016. Paula Bali, Michaela's mother, worked as a consultant for Saskatchewan's Ministry of Social Services. She's described her daughter, again and again over the years, in strikingly consistent terms. Shy, quiet, a girl who thought carefully about other people's feelings. Mekayla played the violin. She was part of her high school's drama club. At the time she disappeared, she was in the 11th grade at Sacred Heart High School in Yorkton. Friends who knew her described a girl who was thoughtful almost to a fault, someone who paid close attention to what the people around her needed. She wasn't, in her mother's words, a risky kid. She'd never run off before, never disappeared for even a night. She did deal with acne, and she was teased for it sometimes at school. But according to Paula, in the weeks before she vanished, Mekayla actually seemed to be doing better, more confident, more herself. Physically, at the time of her disappearance, Mekayla stood about 5'2" and weighed around 56 kilograms, or 123 pounds. Her natural hair color was red, but like a lot of teenage girls experimenting with their look, she'd dyed it, and on the day she went missing, she was wearing it blonde and wavy. She had blue eyes, a light, fair complexion, and she sometimes wore glasses. She had a small birthmark on her chin, about the size of a dime, a few faint scars on her forehead left over from a childhood bout of chickenpox, and a row of scars on her thigh that came from self-harm. That last detail matters. It tells us that whatever was going on inside Mekayla's head before she disappeared, it wasn't simple. This was a teenage girl carrying real emotional weight in a house that had just lost its patriarch, going through the ordinary chaos of being 16, and also quietly living a second life online, one her family didn't fully see until it was far too late to intervene. We're going to get into that online life in detail, because it may be the single most important thread in this entire case. But first, Let's walk through the day itself, April 12th, 2016. Because, thanks to an enormous amount of surveillance footage gathered from businesses around Yorkton, investigators have been able to reconstruct Michaela's movements almost minute by minute. And it is one of the strangest, most unsettling timelines you will hear in any missing persons case. The night before. To understand April 12th, you have to rewind to April 11th, the Monday before. That afternoon, Michaela climbed into a car with two friends, Shelby Natuk and Oksana Yakichuk, for a quick fast food lunch run. Over that meal, according to what both girls later told police, Michaela brought up the idea of going somewhere. Some of her friends remembered her saying Moose Jaw. Others remembered Prince Albert. Shelby specifically recalled her talking about visiting Regina, framing it as a family vacation. Another classmate, Amy Liang, would later tell investigators something different, that Michaela had mentioned a man named Christopher, who was supposedly coming all the way from wherever he lived to meet her in Saskatchewan. And then there was Josh. Multiple friends remembered Michaela mentioning a boy by that name in the days leading up to her disappearance. When Shelby tried to bring him up in a text message on April 11th, Michaela didn't respond. Police would later track down and interview several men named Josh connected to Michaela's life, including one from a nearby town who told a CBC reporter in a brief social media exchange that he'd known her years earlier through a youth program, that the contact had faded, restarted briefly, and faded again, and that they hadn't spoken in years. Investigators cleared him of any involvement. That same evening, April 11th, Michaela asked Shelby for a ride the next morning to a TD Bank branch on Broadway Street. Shelby couldn't do it, so the next day, Michaela would end up walking there alone. Also worth noting, this was a household still raw from loss. Michaela's grandfather, who lived in the same home, had passed away only a month earlier. Whatever grief that stirred in a 16-year-old girl already juggling a hidden online life and a body image struggle severe enough to leave scars, we can only guess at how it was weighing on her that week. April 12th, 2016. The timeline. At 6:41 in the morning, before school, Michaela texted her friend Oksana. She asked for a ride to the bank. She told Oksana she had $5,000 sitting in her account. It wasn't true. Later financial records showed nothing close to that figure. Oksana said no, she couldn't drive her. Whatever Michaela was hoping that money would fund, she was going to have to find another way to get it, or fake having it. At around 8:10 a.m., Michaela's grandmother, Margaret Niebergall, dropped her off at Sacred Heart High School, just like any other morning. Michaela went inside, walked to her locker, put a binder away, and by 8:25, she was gone again, slipping out through a back entrance. School had barely started. From there, she walked toward downtown Yorkton, toward the TD Bank on Broadway Street. She arrived at 8:51 a.m., but the bank hadn't opened its doors yet, so she waited outside on the phone. And here's where the case starts to get genuinely strange. That call, like every other call she placed that day, never showed up on her phone billing records. Not one of them. Which strongly suggests she wasn't making regular cellular calls at all, but using an internet-based calling feature through one of the apps on her phone, the kind of call that leaves a record with the app's parent company, not with the phone carrier. When the bank finally opened at 8:55, she hung up, walked in, and withdrew $55 in cash. From the bank, she headed to a pawn shop called Terry's Pawn and Bargain, a few blocks north. She tried to sell a silver ring. The owner, a man named Terry Hedden, turned her down. The ring wasn't worth enough to bother buying. He'd later tell police she didn't seem upset about it, didn't argue, just accepted it and walked back out onto the street. But think about what that moment tells us. A girl with $55 cash in her pocket, trying to scrape together more money by pawning jewelry before 9 in the morning on a school day. Whatever she was planning, $55 wasn't going to cover it. Around 9:10 a.m., she walked into a combined Tim Hortons and Wendy's restaurant and ordered a drink. She sat alone in a booth for roughly 15 minutes, mostly looking down at her phone. But the security footage shows her glancing up and turning around at least 3 separate times whenever the door opened, as if she was watching for someone specific to walk in. At one point, the footage appears to show her taking her phone apart, pulling the back off, maybe removing the battery. Nobody knows exactly why. It could be as mundane as an old phone freezing up and needing a hard reset. It could be something else entirely. Some have speculated she may have been swapping the SIM card. There's no way to confirm it from footage alone. At 9:23, she starts tapping her hand nervously on the table. Seconds later, she grabs her backpack, a backpack she never normally brought to school, which one friend later flagged as strange all on its own, and heads for the exit. But she doesn't just leave. She walks toward the west door, stops, turns around, and leaves through a completely different exit on the east side of the building instead. It's a small, strange, deliberate-looking piece of behavior, and nobody has ever explained it. For the next 20 minutes, between 9:30 and 9:50, cameras track her walking in loops, north on one street, north on another, cutting back through a parking lot, all while texting and talking on the phone. It's worth noting that this stretch of downtown Yorkton happens to be where several of the town's hotels are clustered. At 9:50, she walks back into the same Tim Hortons, phone still pressed to her ear, and at 10:12 a.m., she sends the message that would become the most haunting line in this entire case. To her friend Shelby, she texts, "Hey, I need help." Shelby doesn't see it. She left her phone at home that day. Michaela waits. Then, sometime after another phone call, she sends a second message. "Never mind. I figured it out." We will never know what she needed help with in that gap between those two texts. We only know that whatever the problem was, in her own mind, she'd solved it. At 10:25, she leaves the restaurant again, comes back a minute later, makes another call, and then approaches a woman inside the restaurant and asks her, a total stranger, to help her book a hotel room. The woman says no. Michaela puts the phone back to her ear, grabs her bag, and walks out for the last time at around 10:40 a.m. From there, she walks west on Broadway Street, briefly turns down another street, doubles back, and continues past a hotel that has since closed down. And then, nothing. Between 10:45 and roughly 11:55 a.m., there is no footage of Mekayla Bali anywhere. A little over an hour, completely unaccounted for, despite the fact that the walk between that last known point and her school takes a fit adult only 15 to 20 minutes on foot. Where those extra 40 minutes went is one of the case's enduring blank spaces. At noon, she reappears, back at Sacred Heart High School, walking into the lobby to talk to 2 classmates. She tells them she's planning to catch a bus to Regina for a vacation. One of those students would later tell investigators, with some uncertainty, that Michaela might have been carrying a second phone. If true, it would neatly explain the untraceable calls. But no second phone ever turns up on any camera, and the source herself wasn't fully sure of what she saw. 3 minutes after walking in, at 12:02 p.m., surveillance shows Michaela walking back out of the school's front doors, turning a corner, and disappearing from that camera's view. That clip is the last time Mekayla Bali was captured on camera at her school. And, as we'll get to, very possibly the last confirmed sighting of her anywhere. From the school, she walked to the Trail Stop restaurant, a diner attached to the local STC bus depot on 1st Avenue North. At some point between roughly noon and 1 o'clock, she sat down alone and ordered a plate of poutine. There are no security cameras inside that particular restaurant, so we have no footage of her there at all, only witness accounts. An employee at the depot would later say Michaela asked what time the next bus was leaving. She was told 5 o'clock. She never bought a ticket. Sometime between 1 o'clock and 1:45 in the afternoon, Mekayla Bali finished her meal, walked out the front door of the Trail Stop restaurant, and vanished completely. By 7 o'clock the next morning, her phone was dead or switched off. It has never connected to a network since. Reported missing. Michaela's grandmother, Margaret, sat in the school parking lot that afternoon until 3:40 p.m., waiting for a granddaughter who was never going to walk out those doors. By that evening, with no word from her and no answer on her phone, the family called it in. Mekayla Bali was reported missing on the night of April 12, 2016. What made the case immediately difficult for the RCMP was the sheer size of the blank spaces in her day. A missing 16-year-old who vanishes from a single location at a known time is one kind of investigation. A missing 16-year-old who spends her final morning weaving in loops through downtown, making a string of calls that never appear on any phone bill, considering, and possibly discarding, a second device, and disappearing for a solid hour with no explanation, is something else entirely. It reads less like an abduction of opportunity and more like a plan, possibly her own, possibly someone else's, unfolding step by step in front of cameras that couldn't capture the one thing that actually mattered: who she was talking to. The online life. This is the part of the case that investigators, journalists, and true crime podcasters alike keep circling back to, because it may hold the real answer. Michaela had an extensive presence across multiple social media and messaging platforms, and she used a variety of different aliases while doing it. Not unusual for a teenager in the mid-2010s, but unusually extensive by the accounts of people who knew her. On March 1st, 2016, about 6 weeks before she disappeared, she posted the same message on both Snapchat and one of her Instagram accounts. She was looking for people to add her on Snapchat because, in her words, she felt like she had no real friends in real life. It's a small, painfully ordinary post from a lonely teenager, but investigators have since flagged it as a possible starting point. A moment when someone with bad intentions could have seen a vulnerable kid publicly advertising her own isolation and reached out. Digging into that online history turned out to be brutally slow work. Much of the data investigators needed sat with tech companies based in the United States, and cross-border privacy law created serious delays in getting records released. Paula Bali has said publicly that she handed over every password and every piece of account access she had to help move things along faster. One app in particular kept surfacing in conversations with Michaela's friends and in the RCMP's own commentary. Kik, a messaging platform that, at the time, let users sign up and chat anonymously with no phone number required. Friends of Michaela's pointed to Kik specifically as a place where she'd talk to people neither they nor her family had ever met or vetted, a platform that offered essentially zero built-in parental oversight and made it trivially easy for an adult with bad intentions to approach a teenager while hiding behind a username. Add to that the mentions of Josh and Christopher, names tied to men who, as far as anyone has been able to determine, existed primarily or entirely in Michaela's online conversations, and you start to see the shape of the theory that's dominated this case for years. That sometime in the weeks or months before she disappeared, Michaela was in contact with somebody online, somebody who either convinced her to run to them voluntarily or who lured her out that morning with false promises and then took her. It's also worth remembering that after she disappeared, an Instagram account under her name was discovered, with hundreds of followers, no posts, and a bio that read simply, "Goodbye." Whether that account was hers, was created by her before vanishing, or was set up afterward by someone else entirely, has never been publicly confirmed. Theories. Investigators and armchair detectives alike have circled a handful of possibilities over the past decade. The first is that Michaela ran away voluntarily, that the money withdrawal, the pawned ring, the loops around downtown Yorkton's hotels, and the vacation cover story to her classmates were all steps in a plan to leave home and meet someone she'd connected with online, whether that someone turned out to be trustworthy or not. Under this theory, she may still be alive somewhere, living under a different identity, for reasons ranging from simple teenage rebellion to something far darker, like ongoing coercive control by whoever she went to meet. The second is that she was lured to a specific meeting point that morning, potentially by Josh, by Christopher, or by some other online contact entirely, under the belief she was meeting a friend or romantic interest, and that this person then harmed her or trafficked her, rather than helping her the way she expected. The third, less discussed but never ruled out, is that something happened to her that had nothing to do with any online contact at all, that a person from her everyday life in Yorkton, someone local, intercepted her that day. None of these theories has ever been confirmed. None of them has ever been eliminated either. The RCMP's Historical Case Unit, within the Major Crimes Branch, still classifies this as an open investigation, and as recently as the case's 10th anniversary, in April of 2026, they've stated plainly that they continue to review every one of the more than 1,000 tips the public has sent in since 2016. Sightings. Despite an investigation that's now run longer than Michaela was alive at the time she vanished, there has never been one single confirmed sighting of her since April 12, 2016. There have, however, been a number of reported ones, the most persistent of which pulled her mother across the country entirely. At one point, reports surfaced placing a girl resembling Michaela in Vancouver, British Columbia, more than 1,000 kilometers from Yorkton. Mekayla Bali flew out there herself and appealed directly to local media, hoping the added exposure might shake loose more information or, better yet, bring her daughter forward. Nothing came of it. Other tips reportedly placed her in various towns and cities over the following years, but as of the case's most recent public updates, none has ever led investigators to Michaela herself. What has stayed remarkably consistent, according to police, is the total absence of any activity tied to her identity. No financial transactions, no social media logins, no border crossings. In the words used by more than one outlet covering the case, there has been absolutely no electronic footprint of the missing teen since the day she vanished. Nothing through banking, nothing through social platforms, no digital trace at all. For a girl who lived as much of her life online as Michaela did, that total, decade-long silence is arguably the most unsettling fact in the entire case. The fight to keep her name alive. From the very beginning, Mekayla Bali made a decision that a lot of families in her position eventually make. She refused to let her daughter's case fade quietly into a filing cabinet. She organized fundraising drives, gave interviews, showed up at vigils, and pushed relentlessly to keep Michaela's name circulating in the public conversation, year after year, long after most missing persons cases lose their media oxygen entirely. That fundraising work built a reward fund that has grown in stages over the past decade. It started at 25,000 Canadian dollars for information leading to Michaela's safe return. In December of 2018, an anonymous donor stepped in and doubled it to 50,000. Then, in January of 2020, that same donor had to ask for a portion of the money back, cutting the fund down to roughly half. Around the 5-year anniversary, community fundraising pushed it back up to $40,000. And then, on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance in 2026, another anonymous donor added a further $60,000, bringing the total reward available today to an even $100,000. one of the largest standing rewards attached to a missing persons case in Canada. The case has also drawn in institutional support well beyond the reward fund. In mid-2017, when Michaela would have turned 18, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States joined the search, helping distribute information about her across North America. That same year, the Missing Children Society of Canada featured her case as one of 10 highlighted nationally for International Missing Children's Day. Media coverage has followed a familiar arc for a case this unresolved. Local news first, then national attention, then true crime specialists. CTV Regina and Global News both produced dedicated coverage over the years, including a 2019 television feature called Still Searching: The Disappearance of Mekayla Bali, which went on to win a Trina McQueen Award for TV news programming and an Edward R. Murrow Award the following month, a rare level of journalistic recognition for a local missing persons story. That same year, journalists Victoria Din and Alicia Bridges produced an in-depth long-form feature that included interviews with several of Michaela's high school friends, digging much deeper into her final morning than any earlier report had managed. The case has since made its way through a string of true crime podcasts as well, including Dark Poutine, True North True Crime Timeline, and, reaching arguably its largest audience yet, an episode of Crime Junkie, one of the most widely listened to true crime podcasts in North America. A decade later. On April 12, 2026, Mekayla Bali's family marked 10 full years since she disappeared. As they have every year, they held a vigil in Yorkton, this year at the Full Gospel House of Prayer on Betts Avenue. Friends, neighbors, and community members gathered around candles, flowers, and a small memorial display that included Michaela's own violin. The evening's speakers included the leader of a youth program Michaela had once attended, and, fittingly, her old music teacher, who served as the night's host. In interviews around the anniversary, Paula Bali described what a decade of not knowing does to a family. Her two younger children, 9 and 7 years old when their sister vanished, are now young adults who grew up entirely in the shadow of her absence. Paula has said that when her son turned 16, the exact age Michaela was when she disappeared, he told her that he'd made it past that age and that they were going to be okay. It's the kind of quietly devastating detail that only surfaces in a family that has spent 10 years treating a normal teenage milestone as something to survive. Paula has also been candid about something a lot of families of the long-term missing eventually have to say out loud: that she isn't naive about what may have happened to her daughter, and that if Michaela is out there somewhere, alive, she may also be carrying reasons of her own for staying hidden. It's a rare, painfully honest acknowledgement, a mother holding space for every possible outcome at once, from the most hopeful to the most horrifying, because after 10 years, closing off any single possibility feels like giving something up. The RCMP, for their part, issued a public statement around the same anniversary, confirming that Michaela's historical case unit file remains active, that they've now logged and investigated more than 1,000 individual tips since 2016, and that they specifically believe people who may not have felt comfortable coming forward in 2016, for whatever reason, might be ready to talk now, a decade removed from whatever happened. Investigators continue to ask anyone with even a small fragment of information to contact the RCMP directly at 310-RCMP, or to reach out anonymously through Saskatchewan Crime Stoppers. Closing. 10 years on, the facts of this case remain almost unbearably specific and almost entirely unexplained. We know, nearly to the minute, everywhere Mekayla Bali walked on the morning of April 12, 2016. We know she withdrew cash, tried to pawn a ring, packed an unusual backpack, told at least 2 different versions of a vacation story, and made a string of phone calls that have never been traced to any device or any person. We know she typed the words, "I need help," to a friend who never saw them in time, and that, Whatever the crisis was, she apparently resolved it on her own within minutes, without anyone else's help at all. And then, walking out of a small bus depot restaurant on a quiet street in a small prairie city, she was simply gone. No struggle caught on camera. No witness who saw her get into a car. No trace, digital or otherwise, in the 10 years since. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to Mekayla Bali. Maybe it's someone who was 17 or 18 themselves back in 2016, scared of the consequences of coming forward. Maybe it's someone who has since moved, or grown older, or simply had a decade to think about whether silence is still worth keeping. If you know anything at all, Saskatchewan RCMP and Crime Stoppers are still listening, and it is never too late to come forward. If this case affected you the way it affected our team putting it together, let us know in the comments, and consider subscribing to Vanishing Point for more of the cases that stay unsolved long after the headlines fade. Until next time, stay safe, and thank you for watching.